No one expected what happened next. In a live congressional hearing, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't just embarrass Speaker Mike Johnson. She completely destroyed his career with evidence so damning that he literally couldn't speak. The most powerful man in Congress, reduced to stunned silence on national television. But to understand how we got to this historic moment of political annihilation, we need to go back to the beginning. If you believe corrupt politicians should be exposed, smash that like button and subscribe right now, because what you're about to witness is the most satisfying takedown in modern political history. This isn't just another political scandal. This is the moment when the facade of power crumbled in real time, broadcast to millions. The look on Johnson's face when he realized he had nowhere to hide? Absolutely priceless. And the way Crockett methodically dismantled his entire career? You have to see it to believe it. Inside the U.S. Capitol, tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. Every seat was taken, every camera positioned with precision, every reporter poised with pen in hand, anticipation crackling through the marble chamber. This wasn't just another hearing. It was political theater disguised as procedure, a carefully staged battlefield where careers would be made or destroyed under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. On one side stood Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, a man who had climbed to one of the most powerful positions in American government through decades of calculated networking and strategic alliances. His crisp suit and rehearsed smile projected the confidence of someone who believed rules were for others, a man accustomed to wielding power like a weapon and procedure like armor. On the other side sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, deliberately placed at the far end of the mahogany table, her nameplate misspelled, her microphone positioned awkwardly, all calculated slights from a system designed to diminish her presence before she spoke a single word. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Establishment versus outsider, entrenched power versus emerging voice, arrogance versus preparation. Johnson entered to thunderous applause from Republicans, a king entering his court, flanked by aides and drowning in adulation. His stride was rehearsed, his smile dripping with the comfort of unchecked authority. Crockett sat alone, fingertips grazing a folder that would soon detonate the speaker's career, her calm demeanor masking the storm she was about to unleash. The Republicans rose to their feet, clapping as if witnessing a coronation rather than the entrance of a man under scrutiny. Johnson didn't acknowledge Crockett. He didn't need to. His message was already loud and clear. This is my room, and you're just lucky they let you sit down. When Crockett was finally given the floor, she managed just 6 words before Johnson's gavel crashed down with the force of a man accustomed to silencing opposition. "Hold it," he barked, not even looking at her directly, his contempt barely concealed behind parliamentary procedure. Before the Congresswoman from Texas launches another TikTok rant, let's remind ourselves this is a hearing, not a content farm. Republican laughter rippled through the chamber like a coordinated attack, polished and poisonous, designed to humiliate rather than humor. Johnson leaned back, theatrical and smug, a performer playing to his audience. We're here to discuss federal appropriations, not rack up followers on social media. His attack escalated, each word more deliberate and cruel than the last, calculated to diminish not just her argument, but her very legitimacy in that room. What we need are lawmakers who actually understand the federal ledger, not influencers playing dress-up with a budget binder. He gestured mockingly toward Crockett, never using her name, only referring to her as the gentle woman, as if her identity wasn't worthy of acknowledgement, as if her presence was merely tolerated rather than respected. The way he said gentle woman sliced through the air like a blade dipped in condescension, each syllable dripping with disdain. Some of us built careers on law and governance, he sneered, others on viral moments and stunt performances. Staffers behind him snickered, the sound confirming permission had been granted to condescend. The message was crystal clear. You don't belong here. You were never meant to. This chamber requires more than rehearsed hashtags and political cosplay. If you're as disgusted by this blatant disrespect as I am, hit that like button right now. Because what you're about to see is exactly what happens when power underestimates intelligence. And it's absolutely glorious. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't rise to the bait or show a single crack in her composure. Her face remained unreadable, frozen in the kind of stillness that only forms when rage is being channeled into focus, when emotion is being transformed into precision. Her eyes shifted slowly, surgically, locking onto Johnson like a sniper, adjusting for wind, calculating the exact moment to strike. What he mistook for silence was actually coiling energy. What he interpreted as defeat was ignition. The lights from the cameras reflected in her pupils like the shimmer of steel. And for a split second, the smirk on Johnson's face faltered. Not much, but enough to notice. Around the chamber, Democrats shifted uncomfortably, caught between procedural protocol and the desire to intervene. A few whispered to staffers, others stared straight ahead, knowing this wasn't just a hearing, it was a power play. Johnson wasn't arguing policy, he was establishing territory, and Jasmine had been marked for humiliation from the moment she walked through the door. She was the only black woman at the table, the only one seated near the back, the only one whose mic had to be manually adjusted when she sat down. It wasn't coincidence, it was choreography, a deliberate attempt to frame her as an outsider, as someone who didn't deserve equal footing in this hallowed chamber. Johnson leaned forward, voice syrupy with faux courtesy. If the gentlewoman insists on continuing, I suggest she stay within the bounds of parliamentary relevance. And please, spare us the melodrama. The way he said melodrama sliced through the air like a blade dipped in condescension. This wasn't politics anymore. It was public shaming, an attempt to break her spirit before she could make her case. The chamber was so still you could hear the ceiling lights humming, a low electrical drone that seemed to underscore the tension. All eyes turned to Crockett. Even those who had mocked her moments earlier now leaned forward, compelled by something they didn't expect. Stillness, poise, control. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, not quiet, but restrained, like a fuse not yet lit, like a weapon being carefully aimed before firing. I'm not here to entertain anyone, she said, enunciating each syllable with deliberate calm that made her words feel heavier than if she'd shouted them, each one landing with the weight of certainty rather than the flash of anger. I am not here to play a role in someone else's performance. I am here to confront a sickness that's been growing in this room quietly, comfortably, behind closed doors and hidden footnotes. She paused, not because she needed to, but because they did. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with tension, shame, and defiance. A moment where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. I'm here, she continued, eyes scanning the panel slowly, measuring the temperature of the room, counting the seconds, watching the rhythm of Johnson's performance like a boxer studying an opponent's footwork. To expose the men who've weaponized bureaucracy, who've buried millions under technicalities, and who've turned the law into a shield for their lies. Her words didn't rise in volume. They sank in like poison, the kind of calm that rattled because it didn't beg to be heard. It demanded to be felt. No theatrics, no dramatics, just truth, raw and sharp, laid bare under the same fluorescent lights that had once been aimed at her like interrogation beams. Across the table, some shifted in their seats. A Republican aide stopped typing. One congressman furrowed his brow as if trying to decide whether to speak or keep his head down. Johnson didn't move, his face frozen into something between disdain and unease. And that was the tell, just a twitch at the edge of his lip, a flicker of awareness that maybe, just maybe, he had misjudged the woman at the end of the table. Johnson responded with mockery, not logic. He didn't counter her with facts or rebut her with policy. Instead, he leaned back with the smug posture of someone who believed authority was armor, a shield against accountability. A faint, scoffing laugh escaped him, cold, rehearsed, meant for the cameras rather than genuine amusement. If the gentlewoman has evidence, he said, dragging the words gentlewoman like it was a costume that didn't fit her, then I encourage her to present it. The rest of us came here to discuss federal policy, not conspiracy fiction. He paused, scanning the room, gauging the weight of his own words, letting them hang like smoke in the chamber. Though between us, he added, now leaning slightly toward his mic with the practiced intimacy of someone sharing a joke at someone else's expense, I sincerely doubt she even knows what the budget appendix actually is, let alone how to read one. The slight tremble of forced amusement in his voice betrayed the real motive. Not defense, but dominance. Not disagreement, but dismissal. It wasn't just that he questioned her data. He questioned her intellect, her credibility, her right to even sit at the table. A few chuckles fluttered across his side of the aisle. The kind of sound that confirms permission has been granted to condescend, to treat a colleague not as an equal, but as an intruder. Let's not pretend that grandstanding and social media theatrics substitute for understanding the federal ledger, he said. We're dealing with real numbers here, not sound bites. The insult was transparent and deliberate. He wasn't debating a colleague. He was publicly reducing her to a caricature, a loud voice, an empty folder, a face for the algorithm. It was the kind of insult that didn't come from policy disagreements, but from a deeper place, where power defends itself not by argument, but by erasure. And in that moment, surrounded by suits and silence, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just being challenged. She was being tested, in front of the nation, under the full weight of a system that had never expected her to speak, much less strike back. He had mocked her command of numbers, scoffed at her understanding of procedure, but what he didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett didn't come armed with rhetoric. She came armed with receipts. And if you think his condescension was bad, wait until you see what happens when she pulls out the evidence he never thought existed. Without theatrics, she reached for the folder in front of her. Her fingers moved deliberately, not rushed, not nervous, like someone setting the final piece in place, like a chess player who had anticipated this move many steps ago. She slid a document onto the table and tapped twice. Behind her, the tech assistant responded instantly. The room dimmed slightly as the screen at the front of the chamber came to life. Not with an opinion, not with a speech, but with hard, unrelenting data. Government seal, time-stamped, verified by the Office of the Inspector General. And across the screen, rows of transactions spilled out in quiet devastation, each line another nail in Johnson's political coffin. This document is a financial audit conducted by the IG, Crockett said evenly, almost too calmly, her composure in stark contrast to the bombshell she was detonating. It outlines a pattern of disbursements totaling $93 million, all routed through expedited infrastructure funds under Section 17B, funds that, on paper, were meant for emergency response. The screen scrolled methodically, revealing the architecture of corruption in cold, hard numbers. 3 names appeared, each tied to companies with nondescript titles and no public-facing operations. Each company had appeared only once on a federal contract, and all 3, as the audit showed, shared direct ties to a single individual, Grant Holland. Mr. Holland, Jasmine continued, still staring forward with unwavering focus, has been a campaign strategist, private consultant, and personal friend to Speaker Johnson for over a decade. These companies list him as either executive officer or major shareholder. In all 3 cases, the funds arrived within 10 days of his meetings with the Speaker's office. The room had turned to stone. Republicans, moments earlier full of laughter and posture, now sat motionless, frozen in the harsh light of exposure. One congressman rubbed his temple. Another shuffled papers just to avoid looking up. The air itself had changed. Less oxygen, more pressure, the weight of truth crushing the space for denial. Johnson didn't interrupt. He couldn't. His expression hadn't changed much, but the tell was there. One twitch in the corner of his jaw, one blink too slow, the microscopic tells of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Jasmine let the moment breathe. Let the reality sink in before delivering her next blow. The contracts were hidden in an appendix most members never reviewed. No bidding process, no oversight, just signatures. His, she said, tapping the document again with quiet emphasis. Then she turned her gaze directly to him, her eyes never wavering. I may not have a long title, but I read every line they thought I'd skip. Her tone never wavered. She didn't need volume. She had something better. Evidence that didn't blink, didn't lie, didn't flinch. And as the numbers continued scrolling across the screen, Like a silent indictment, it was no longer Jasmine Crockett who had to prove herself. It was Mike Johnson who couldn't afford to speak. If you're as shocked as everyone in that room was, drop a comment right now with the word exposed. Because what you're witnessing isn't just political theater. It's the moment when corruption meets its match. But Crockett was just getting started. The evidence had struck like a hammer. Clean, cold, indisputable. But she knew that when truth cornered power, it wouldn't surrender easily. She reached for a second folder. Thicker, darker, sealed with a red paperclip. And the room, already on edge, went still again, bracing for the next revelation. There was no build-up this time, no preamble, just a quiet click as Jasmine snapped the folder open and slid printed pages across the table. With a nod to the technician, the documents appeared on screen, one by one, each bearing the header of the Office of the Speaker. Official timestamps, internal routing, all authentic, all damning in their bureaucratic precision. These, she began, her voice calm but cutting through the silence like a blade, are internal communications from the Speaker's own office. Not rumors, not secondhand speculation. Direct messages between senior staff coordinating financial reallocation through undisclosed third parties. The first email projected clearly, its subject line reading vendor diversion confirmation, keep external. The text beneath was worse, laying bare the deliberate nature of the scheme. Move total via grants vehicle. Avoid naming until Q3. Use legacy PAC format if questioned. Jasmine looked up, her gaze sweeping across the now silent chamber. This is not oversight, she said, her words landing with precision. This is a map, a deliberate trail. No one interrupted as she moved to the second email, her tone still composed, still methodical in its devastation. Here we see planning. Coordinate Shell invoices with Holland before disclosure deadline. Confirm Johnson's sign-off. This is from his deputy. That sign-off isn't hypothetical. It's written, it's dated, and it matches the document we've already submitted to this hearing. The screen flipped to email 3, a budget flowchart titled Channel Masking Options, Compliant Presentation. Jasmine pointed to one line that read, split into 3 firms to avoid thresholds, rotate signatories. The words weren't flashy. They were cold, technical, real. The kind of language not meant to be heard outside closed doors. The quiet machinery of corruption laid bare under the harsh light of public scrutiny. And finally, she said, clicking the last tab, confirmation. On screen, the final email revealed itself. No euphemisms, no vague planning, just a blunt message from a staffer to Johnson's deputy. Speaker approved. Proceed same structure as February. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The documents did the screaming for her, each line another crack in Johnson's facade. These aren't miscommunications, she said with devastating simplicity. They're instructions. This wasn't just a misuse of funds. It was political laundering, hidden under bureaucratic camouflage, protected by the power of his title. Around her, silence. The kind that only comes when people realize what they're hearing isn't just serious. It's historic. A moment when the machinery of power is exposed in all its cynical calculation. Johnson didn't speak. Couldn't. He had gone from authority figure to liability in under 3 minutes. And Jasmine Crockett, standing firm, hadn't blinked once. 4 emails had just ripped the mask off the institution. And in the silence that followed, Mike Johnson did the only thing a man cornered by truth knows how to do. He exploded. Johnson lurched forward, his composure shattering in real time. The polished statesman replaced by raw, desperate fury. You are disgracing this chamber, he shouted, the words ricocheting off the marble walls, not to persuade, but to overwhelm, to drown out the evidence with sheer volume. What you've brought forward is not oversight. It's an assault on the integrity of this institution. It's reckless. It's fabricated. It's beneath the dignity of Congress. His hand slammed against the desk for emphasis, though it trembled slightly, betraying the fury's foundation. Fear, naked and undisguised. This is nothing more than a political stunt, he continued, gesturing wildly toward the screen, his movements erratic, uncontrolled. An attempt to smear reputations with loosely connected figures and cherry-picked contracts. There was desperation in his rhythm now, the panic of a man who realized the room no longer belonged to him, that the walls weren't listening out of respect anymore. They were waiting to hear what she would say next. "You are turning this hall into a theater of lies, Congresswoman. You are manipulating numbers you clearly don't understand to push a false narrative, to poison this chamber with conspiracy and ego." His voice cracked slightly, barely, but it did, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped completely. This wasn't strength. It was the panic of a man who had spent too long speaking from a pedestal instead of answering from the floor. But Jasmine didn't meet fire with fire. She met it with something far more dangerous. The truth, timed like a blade, wielded with surgical precision. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice or strike with dramatics. Instead, she let the silence stretch long enough for the adrenaline in the room to turn inward, for every gaze to refocus on her. Then in a tone so even it felt almost surgical, she asked, "If this is all just conjecture, Mr. Speaker, then why did you sign off on those transfers without any audit documentation on file?" Her voice wasn't accusatory. It was worse. It was exact, calculated, impossible to twist. The question didn't call for debate. It called for reckoning, the kind of reckoning a man isn't prepared for when he spent too long believing in his own invincibility. The temperature in the room dropped by degrees. Staffers glanced at one another. Members froze mid-note. The screen behind her still displayed the damning flow of funds, but now all attention had shifted to his reaction, to the moment when power meets its match in truth. For 5 long seconds, the Speaker of the House sat speechless. Not thoughtful, not patient, just caught, exposed, stripped of the authority he had wielded like a weapon just minutes before. Finally, with a voice that had lost its edge, he muttered, "Because I trust my technical staff." But the moment he said it, he knew he'd miscalculated. It was a placeholder response, vague, institutional, a line from the oldest page in the political survival playbook. And it wasn't enough. Not this time. Not against this opponent. Not with these receipts. If you're watching a powerful man squirm and loving every second of it, smash that like button right now. Because the knockout punch is coming, and it's even more devastating than you can imagine. "That's interesting," Jasmine said, her voice still calm but now touched with something sharper. The quiet confidence of someone holding the winning hand. "Because according to this memo," she held up a crisp, single-page document, "you didn't just authorize the transfer, you wrote the instruction by hand. Right here." She stepped forward slightly and handed the page to the clerk, who passed it up to the dais. Cameras zoomed in on it almost immediately, capturing the moment in high-definition clarity. At the top, the Speaker's letterhead, official and unmistakable. In the center, a single paragraph, short and direct, leaving no room for interpretation. At the bottom, his unmistakable signature, dated and accompanied by a brief handwritten note. "Proceed immediately. Do not delay with formal review." The clerk hadn't even finished placing the page before gasps echoed quietly through the chamber, the collective sound of political oxygen being sucked from the room. There was no ambiguity, no plausible deniability. This wasn't buried in a stack of anonymous approvals. It was personal, it was direct, it was damning. The smoking gun that transformed suspicion into certainty. "This note bypassed standard oversight protocol," she said, eyes never leaving Johnson, tracking every micro-expression, every tell. "It was issued prior to any supporting documentation from the subcommittees, and it overrode internal cautionary flags from your own compliance unit. So let me ask again, was this the work of your technical staff, or was this your decision?" Her tone never broke. It didn't need to. The room was already collapsing into her rhythm, the carefully constructed hierarchy of power giving way to the simple, devastating force of accountability. One Republican congressman glanced at the document and quickly looked away. Another pressed his lips together and folded his arms, the reflex of a man retreating inward, distancing himself from the impending collapse. Johnson stared at the paper now, but he didn't touch it. He didn't blink. For all his previous bravado, for all the noise he had brought into the room, he now found himself trapped in a moment he couldn't shout his way out of. Every camera was fixed on his face. Every journalist in the press gallery had leaned forward. They weren't recording a debate anymore. They were witnessing a reckoning, the moment when power meets its match, not in greater power, but in irrefutable truth. Jasmine stepped back into her seat slowly, without turning away from him, her movements deliberate, controlled. "You challenged my understanding of the appendix," she said softly, "but I read it. Every word, every footnote, every buried clause. And while you were counting on no one else to notice, I kept going." There was no triumph in her voice, just a steady, unflinching declaration of truth. "You underestimated what happens when someone actually pays attention." And in that moment, for the first time during the hearing, it wasn't Jasmine Crockett who looked like the outsider. It was Mike Johnson, isolated, exposed, and sitting beneath a truth he could no longer control. The signature had shaken the floor beneath him, but Jasmine knew paper alone wouldn't be enough to bring down a man who had built his career on manipulating procedure. So she gave the room something they couldn't deny, couldn't reinterpret, couldn't bury under legal jargon. She gave them his voice. There was a beat of stillness after the document, a lull, a breath, and in that fragile silence, Jasmine reached forward with quiet finality and tapped the small black device at her side. The overhead monitor shifted. Gone were the spreadsheets, the memos, the audit logs. In their place, a glowing waveform pulsed against a black background. No music, no introduction, just static for half a second, then a voice. Male, calm, measured, and unmistakably Mike Johnson. "The public doesn't need the details," he said in a tone so casual it sounded like small talk over coffee. But in the chamber, the effect was nuclear, devastating in its candor. "They're too busy trying to pay off student loans and gas bills to care where the money goes. We tuck it into line items nobody asks about, nobody reads." The words hit like shrapnel. Not metaphor, not accusation, but confession. And it wasn't paraphrased, wasn't taken out of context, wasn't manipulated. It was his voice, unfiltered, undeniable, like a ghost rising from behind his polished podium to haunt the room that once clapped for him. There was no explosion at first, just a strange, sharp stillness, like everyone was trying to confirm they'd actually heard what they thought they did. Then it broke. Audible gasps, sharp intakes of breath. A Democratic representative seated 2 rows from Johnson whispered, "Jesus," under her breath. Another leaned toward her staffer, hand over mouth. But Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was a spotlight, illuminating the damning words as they continued to flow from the speakers. "We don't need them to understand it," the recording continued, Johnson's voice eerily calm, eerily candid. "We just need them to forget it." That was when the room truly cracked open. Phones came out, not from the public gallery, but from lawmakers, Democrats, independents, even 2 Republicans who couldn't stop their instincts, couldn't resist the urge to document what they were witnessing. They weren't just recording a scandal, they were preserving evidence, capturing the moment when the curtain was pulled back on the machinery of power. Because what was playing wasn't an opinion, it was strategy, not negligence, intent. The kind of behind closed doors calculation that millions of Americans had long suspected but never thought they'd hear out loud. And here it was, broadcast through the marble and wood echo chamber of Congress, in the speaker's own voice. "They won't read the appendix," Johnson's recorded voice continued, the casual contempt in his tone now painfully apparent. "They never do. That's the point." That line drew an audible reaction. A few Republicans whispered between themselves. Some leaned back visibly uncomfortable. Others sat frozen, eyes wide, waiting for someone to intervene. Anyone to stop the bleeding. But Jasmine didn't press pause. She let the full 23 seconds play uninterrupted. Let every syllable land with its full weight. And when it ended, the silence was not just thick, it was suffocating. No rebuttal, no talking points, just the aftershock of clarity. She stepped toward the microphone, not with aggression but gravity. Her words when she spoke were few, steady, devastating. "This isn't about miscommunication, it's about manipulation, calculated, admitted, and now recorded." There was nothing else to say, and for the first time in the entire hearing, Mike Johnson had nothing left to hide behind. Not title, not process, not denial, just silence. His own. If you're still with me, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened next changed American politics forever. This isn't just about one hearing or one scandal. This is about the moment when the entire power structure of Washington, D.C. began to crumble. As the weight of Johnson's own voice still echoed through the chamber, his allies scrambled to buy time, to create distance, to find some procedural escape hatch before the full impact of what had just happened could settle into the public consciousness. Congressman Rhodes, a longtime Johnson supporter, adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke into the mic with the controlled cadence of a man rehearsing damage control. Mr. Chairman, given the nature of the material just introduced and the need to ensure procedural fairness, I formally request that we recess this hearing until the veracity of the audio can be independently reviewed. The words dripped with legal caution, with the careful language of institutional self-preservation. But everyone in the room knew what it really meant. Retreat. Delay. Hope the headlines fade. Hope the public forgets. Hope the news cycle moves on before the full extent of the corruption can be processed. Another Republican congresswoman leaned forward immediately, her voice tight and eyes darting between reporters in the gallery. This is a serious accusation. We should not be proceeding under the shadow of unverified recordings. Their expressions masked it poorly. This wasn't skepticism. It was self-preservation, thinly veiled by formality, the desperate attempt to throw procedural sand in the gears of accountability. The chamber stirred. Aides whispered into earpieces. Some members leaned back, clearly relieved by the suggestion of a procedural lifeline, a way to pause the reckoning that was unfolding in real time. The pressure in the room had become unbearable, and this motion was the escape hatch, the way to transform explosive evidence into committee reviews and closed-door sessions where the public eye couldn't follow. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let them crawl through that escape hatch. She stood, calm, steady, immovable, and with a voice that didn't rise in anger but in absolute clarity, said simply, "No, just that. No procedural jargon, no stalling, just a line in the sand, a refusal to play by the rules that had been designed to protect power from accountability." Then she turned slowly to face the committee, her words following like a gavel slamming shut. Today, the American people are watching. Not tomorrow, not after a weekend of talking points and press releases. Now, we are not going to pause the truth because it makes some of you uncomfortable. We are not going to bury this under a pile of subpoenas and subcommittee referrals. She took a breath, not for drama, but for precision, for emphasis. I will not yield. Not when the highest office in this House is implicated. Not when corruption hides behind bureaucracy. Not when millions of Americans outside these walls have been told again and again that no one listens. The room had gone still again, but not with fear this time, with reckoning, with the realization that the usual tactics of delay and distraction weren't going to work. Not against this opponent, not with this evidence. She wasn't arguing anymore. She was refusing to move, and in that refusal, the hearing didn't pause. It escalated, moving from exposure to action with breathtaking speed. From the far left bench, Representative Caleb Rose stood with the kind of stillness that commands immediate attention. Known for his refusal to play party politics and for a voting record that rarely bent to either side, Rose was not a man who spoke unless he had measured every syllable, unless he was certain of his ground. His eyes didn't wander. He didn't scan the room for permission. He looked straight ahead, voice calm, unflinching, and said, "Mr. Chairman, I am formally calling for an immediate ethics investigation into the conduct of Speaker Mike Johnson." The words were steady, but they landed like thunder, reverberating through the chamber with the force of history being written in real time. There was no flourish, no theater, only the raw simplicity of truth meeting its next step. Accountability, the moment when exposure transforms into action. His voice did not tremble, it did not rise, but it shook the chamber in ways 1,000 gavel strikes never could. Around him, heads turned. Staffers paused mid-keystroke. Even some Republican members who had been quietly bracing for damage control looked away. The weight of that sentence pressing down like gravity, like the inevitable consequence of what they had just witnessed. For a second, just one, the room forgot how to move, suspended in the amber of a moment that everyone present knew would be in history books. Then came the sound of urgency, a chorus of clicks, rapid-fire tapping from the press gallery above as headlines erupted across screens like sparks catching dry grass as the story broke containment and spilled into the national consciousness. Breaking, independent rep calls for ethics probe into House Speaker Johnson. Another followed seconds later. Crockett delivers blow so devastating it silences the Speaker of the House. Reporters scrambled to push updates live. Phones buzzed with notifications before the committee's microphones even went quiet. But the story didn't need embellishment, didn't need hyperbole. Jasmine's voice had carried the facts, the emails had carried the proof, and Johnson's silence was carrying the guilt, the unmistakable admission of a man who had run out of defenses. He didn't speak. He didn't rise to object. He didn't lean into the mic. He didn't even lift his chin. His right hand, once clenched into a fist just minutes ago, now lay flat against the desk, open, motionless, the color drained from his knuckles. His posture had collapsed inward, spine no longer rigid with pride, but curved beneath the invisible weight of exposure. The man who had moments earlier thundered about garbage and grandstanding now stared blankly at the wood grain in front of him, as if hoping it would swallow him whole. His silence wasn't strategic. It was survival, a final refuge from the reality unraveling in real time. And Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or flash the smile of victory. She remained seated, poised, her face carved in solemn defiance. Her hands rested gently on the folder she had just closed, its contents now echoing across the internet, television, and the consciousness of every person tuned in. She looked to Representative Rose and nodded once, a silent affirmation between truth-tellers. Then she turned back to the committee, not to demand, not to plead, but to affirm what had already become clear. I second the motion for an immediate investigation, and I request that it begin without delay. No one spoke because there was nothing left to argue. Behind her, the screen still glowed, casting a pale light across the stunned faces of the chamber. The emails, the audio, the signatures. It was all there, undeniable. The evidence had spoken. The nation had heard it. And the speaker had nothing left to say. Within hours, the walls of power weren't just trembling. They were being battered from the outside in, as the public reaction transformed from shock to outrage to organized demand for accountability. What began as murmurs turned into a roar. National organizations, watchdog coalitions, and bipartisan advocacy groups flooded the airwaves, their messages coordinated not by party but by principle, by the shared recognition that what had been exposed wasn't just a scandal. It was a breach in the foundation of democratic governance. The Government Integrity Project issued a formal letter to Congress. Speaker Johnson has lost the moral and procedural authority to lead this House. We demand his immediate resignation. The American Voters Trust launched an online petition. 500,000 signatures poured in before midnight. Ordinary citizens from across the political spectrum united in their disgust at what they had witnessed. Headlines grew sharper, no longer asking if he should step down, but when the question of his continued leadership no longer debatable, but simply untenable. On CNN, Crockett's evidence sparks national outcry. Groups demand Speaker's ouster. On MSNBC, moral authority shattered. Calls for Johnson's resignation multiply. Even conservative outlets couldn't ignore the fracture, couldn't spin what millions had witnessed with their own eyes. A grim headline from a once friendly editorial board read, "Is this the end of the Johnson era?" The calls weren't just coming from the usual voices, from partisan opponents eager to score political points. Veterans associations expressed outrage at discretionary funds being misused, while military housing remained underfunded. Civic tech groups dissected every email Jasmine had released, annotating the details line by line and releasing them to the public with infographics so damning they went viral in under 20 minutes. On social media, Hashtags like #StepDownJohnson, #Speaker Exposed, and #Crockett Truth dominated trends across platforms, uniting users who normally disagreed on everything else. Prominent figures, former lawmakers, constitutional scholars, even retired judges went on record. This isn't a partisan matter, it's a constitutional crisis. The Speaker's position is untenable. And through it all, Johnson said nothing. No tweet, no press statement, no emergency appearance. His silence became its own scandal, a void where leadership should have stood, replaced by spineless inertia as the tide of accountability rose around him. Former allies began to distance themselves, quietly at first, through back channels and private conversations, then publicly as the political calculus shifted from loyalty to survival. Congressman Eldridge, a senior Republican and longtime supporter, released a statement that sent shockwaves through Washington. The integrity of this chamber must come before loyalty to any one individual. I support an independent investigation and believe Speaker Johnson should consider stepping aside. Moments later, two committee chairs followed suit, the dam of partisan protection cracking under the pressure of undeniable evidence. It wasn't just about damage control anymore. It was about survival for everyone who had once stood beside him, for an entire power structure that suddenly found itself on shifting ground. If you're seeing the dominoes fall and want to make sure corrupt politicians everywhere get the message, hit that like button and share this video right now. The more eyes on this story, the harder it becomes for anyone to bury it. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered, not in the tens but in the thousands. Students, teachers, healthcare workers, veterans, ordinary citizens who had watched the hearing and felt something they hadn't felt in years. The possibility that accountability might actually exist, that truth might actually matter. They held signs quoting Jasmine's words verbatim. Truth is not garbage, and we read what they hoped we'd ignore. The steps of the Capitol filled with voices that echoed the very indictment she had delivered inside. The physical manifestation of a nation that had grown tired of being treated like they wouldn't notice, wouldn't care, wouldn't act. It didn't matter that it wasn't an election year. It didn't matter that she wasn't a committee chair or a party leader. What mattered was that someone had finally stood up and stripped power bare, and the country saw it happen in real time, unfiltered and undeniable. Johnson's team scrambled behind closed doors, legal advisors, media consultants, damage control strategists, but none of them could put the walls back up, not after Jasmine had taken them apart brick by documented brick. Reporters stalked hallways for statements. His staff dodged cameras, and still no words came, because there was no script left to follow, only consequences. And one echo grew louder every hour, from social media to news chyrons to the crowds outside. Resign, resign, resign. This wasn't a storm he could ride out, a news cycle that would pass, a scandal that could be buried under the next distraction. It was the reckoning no one believed would ever come, until it did. And by the time night fell over Washington, D.C., the Speaker of the House no longer looked like a leader. He looked like a man out of moves, out of time, out of power, watching as the institution he thought he controlled turned against him with the same ruthless efficiency he had once wielded against others. In less than 12 hours, Jasmine Crockett went from being a rising but often sidelined voice in Congress to the most searched, watched, and talked about individual in the United States. Her name wasn't just on the news ticker. It was the news, the center of a cultural and political earthquake that continued to send aftershocks through every institution of power. On Google, it skyrocketed past every celebrity, athlete, and public figure, hitting #1 in trending searches by early morning and holding firm for the next 24 hours. News outlets couldn't keep up. Who is Jasmine Crockett? Flooded headlines from the New York Times to BuzzFeed to international media in Europe and Asia, as journalists scrambled to profile the woman who had just rewritten the rules of accountability in American politics. CNN opened their 9 a.m. broadcast with a full 5-minute monologue, from oversight to overhaul, how one Congresswoman redefined accountability. On The View, co-host replayed her now iconic quote, "If you think truth is garbage, you've never written a real law," and the audience erupted in applause. the words resonating far beyond the political bubble of Washington. Clips of her final words to Johnson were spliced with triumphant music, slowed down for effect, captioned and subtitled for virality, shared millions of times across platforms by users who normally paid little attention to congressional hearings. The entire country, it seemed, couldn't stop watching the moment power met its match, couldn't look away from the spectacle of a system being forced to confront its own corruption. Yet this sudden spotlight wasn't just fascination, it was hunger. Americans exhausted by years of deflection, gridlock, and scandals buried beneath legalese were witnessing something they didn't expect. Clarity, the simple, devastating power of truth spoken without fear. Jasmine hadn't outshout her opponent. She had outworked him. She didn't posture, she prepared. And that preparation, the folders, the emails, the audio, the surgical tempo, made her impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to forget. Her quiet fury, her steadiness in the face of shouting, wasn't performative. It was justice distilled into flesh and blood. And the people saw it. They didn't just cheer her, they trusted her. That was what made the impact seismic. Not popularity, but credibility. Not charisma, but conviction. The rare alignment of moral clarity and irrefutable evidence. By mid-afternoon, universities were hosting emergency panels. Law professors dissected her cross-examination style, drawing comparisons to Thurgood Marshall, to Barbara Jordan, to the great truth-tellers of American history. On TikTok, Gen Z creators put her face alongside historic reformers. She's not just trending, one user posted over a video montage. She's rewriting what courage in Congress looks like. On Instagram, artists began sketching her face over illustrations of broken gavels and burning red tape. The aesthetic immediate, the symbolism undeniable. A woman of color who had been dismissed, doubted, sidelined, and mocked, who had the courage to stare down the most powerful man in the chamber and expose him with nothing but documentation and composure, had become a movement, a symbol, a blueprint for what accountability could look like in a system designed to avoid it. And what made it all the more gripping was what came before, because the country remembered. They remembered how she had been talked over, how she'd been called a TikTok congresswoman, how her intelligence had been questioned on a national stage, how the speaker had raised his voice and slammed the table while she never once lost her calm. She had walked into that hearing at a disadvantage, surrounded by people who expected her to fold under pressure, and she walked out with the nation behind her. That kind of reversal doesn't come from a viral moment. It comes from undeniable merit breaking through the institutional fog, from preparation meeting opportunity, from courage facing down intimidation and refusing to blink. White House press correspondents were asked about her in the briefing room. Several sitting senators, usually hesitant to comment on House drama, tweeted their admiration. Civil rights groups, advocacy coalitions, and bipartisan watchdog organizations issued statements hailing her poise and demanding that more hearings be made as transparent as the one she had just led. Editorial boards that had never once published her name ran op-eds with titles like Jasmine Crockett and the Return of Congressional Courage. Her inbox was overwhelmed. Her staff, many of them young, underpaid, and underestimated, were suddenly at the center of a media vortex, trying to coordinate press requests from every major Sunday show while drafting ethics reform proposals requested by committee heads. If you're inspired by her courage and want to see more accountability in politics, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We'll be following this story as it continues to unfold, and you won't want to miss what happens next. And yet, as all this unfolded, this tidal wave of attention, validation, and cultural ascension, Jasmine didn't take a victory lap. She didn't rush to a press podium. She didn't change her tone. She didn't sell the moment. She let the truth breathe. She stayed grounded in the very thing that had carried her through that hearing. The facts, the evidence, the work. She reportedly declined 3 late-night show invitations that same day, not because she wasn't grateful, but because, as one aide told the press, the Congresswoman didn't come here to be famous. She came here to work. She still is. But the people didn't stop watching. If anything, their attention intensified. For every headline that quoted her, There were 10 more replays of her face when Johnson fell silent. For every think piece about the fall of a speaker, there was another about the rise of a woman who had shown America what it looks like to dismantle injustice without raising your voice. And in that attention, something profound took root. She wasn't just the most searched name in America. She was the most believed, because in a nation drowning in noise, Jasmine Crockett did the rarest thing imaginable. She made silence speak, and it echoed everywhere, in every conversation about power, about accountability, about what it means to truly serve the public interest. What Jasmine Crockett gave the country in that hearing wasn't just a masterclass in political accountability. It was a human lesson, brutal in clarity and beautiful in courage. She stood in a chamber designed to silence women like her. She walked into a room that saw her as ornamental, inconvenient, another name on a list, another seat to fill. She was underestimated, interrupted, and branded as performative before she even spoke a full sentence. And yet she didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead for respect. She earned it through patience, through preparation, through principle. That's what made the moment so unbearable for those in power. They hadn't just been exposed by facts. They had been undone by someone who refused to play by the rules they rigged, who refused to accept the limitations they tried to impose, who refused to be anything less than exactly what the moment required, a voice of truth in a room built for echoes. Jasmine proved that integrity is not loud, but unshakable, and when given the space to breathe, it doesn't just speak, it roars in silence. For every second she was mocked, she planted a seed. For every eye that rolled when she asked a question, she sharpened her response. The injustice she faced wasn't just about party or policy. It was the grinding, invisible wall that so many women, especially women of color, face in every arena of power. The smirks, the procedural cutoffs, the casual dismissals. She didn't rage against them. She made them irrelevant. That is the soul of the lesson. Real strength doesn't erupt. It endures. It studies. It waits. And when the moment comes, it reveals. Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose a speaker. She exposed a system, one small crack at a time, until the whole thing began to collapse under the weight of its own rot. And it wasn't just what she uncovered that mattered. It was how. She never made it about herself. She didn't cry victim. She didn't center emotion. She centered facts. She trusted that truth, when wielded with discipline and unshakable resolve, was enough. And it was. That's the most human lesson of all. When everything is stacked against you, when your voice is the smallest in the room, you don't have to scream to be heard. You have to stand. You have to believe in the merit of your cause more than they believe in the power of their position. And then, when they mock you, when they try to dismiss you, you answer with proof, with poise, with purpose. Millions watched Jasmine's composure, but too few saw the cost. The hours of preparation, the weight of carrying her community's expectations, the sting of being labeled angry when she was simply informed, the loneliness of being the only one at the table who knew she'd get no benefit of the doubt. And still, she came. She sat, she spoke. And through that, she gave voice to a generation that had started to wonder if truth could still win. She showed young girls that courage isn't about having power. It's about knowing when to hold the line, even when you don't. She reminded veterans of justice movements that the fight was still alive. She proved to cynics that facts, when delivered without fear, still can break through noise. In the end, what we witnessed wasn't just a hearing, it was a warning. The truth, when spoken with courage, is the most powerful weapon of all. But what do you think? Did Johnson deserve what happened to him? Was Crockett justified in her approach? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see more powerful moments where corruption gets exposed, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. The next bombshell could drop at any moment, and you won't want to miss it. Because what happened in that hearing room wasn't just about one corrupt politician or one brave congresswoman. It was about all of us, about the country we want to live in, about whether we still believe that accountability matters, that truth can prevail, that one person with courage can make a difference. Jasmine Crockett showed us it's possible. Now it's up to us to demand it everywhere else. Thank you for watching this breakdown of one of the most significant political moments in recent history. If this video opened your eyes, please share it with someone who needs to see it. Together, we can ensure that what happened in that hearing room isn't just a viral moment. It's the beginning of a movement for real accountability in American politics.